I saw my wife lock the door on me. My neighbor opened hers, joked that her bed was available, and my wife freaked out in front of the whole building. My own wife has locked me out of my own house. Not because of some emergency, not because of safety concerns, but because she's having what she calls an important phone conversation, and apparently my presence would be too distracting. That's exactly what happened to me last Thursday evening, and it was the moment I realized my marriage had crossed a line I never thought possible. I stood there in the hallway of our apartment building, key in hand, completely useless. The door was locked from the inside with that little chain latch, and I could hear her voice through the door, talking in hushed, secretive tones. When I knocked, she actually had the nerve to tell me through the door to wait outside because she needed privacy. Privacy in our shared home from her own husband. Now, I'm not the type of man who makes scenes or loses his cool easily, but standing in that hallway, I felt something shift. Not anger exactly, but a cold realization that this level of disrespect had somehow become acceptable in my own marriage. How did we get here? When did I become someone who could be dismissed and locked out like an unwelcome visitor? That's when she appeared. My neighbor from across the hall. I'd seen her around plenty of times. Always friendly, always put together. She was coming back from what looked like a gym session. Those fitted workout clothes, showing off curves that were hard to ignore. She noticed me standing there with my keys, looking like an idiot outside my own door. "Locked out?" she asked with a knowing smile that suggested she'd heard the muffled conversation happening behind my door. "Something like that," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. But there was something in her eyes, a spark of mischief mixed with genuine concern. "You know," she said, slowing her walk toward her own door, "if you need somewhere to wait while she finishes her important call, my door's always open." The way she emphasized important call made it clear she understood exactly how ridiculous this situation was. Before I could respond, she added with a playful grin, "I was just about to make some coffee. Real coffee, not that instant stuff." She paused at her door, key in hand, and looked back at me. "The offer stands if you get tired of standing in the hallway like a delivery boy." From inside my apartment, I could still hear my wife's voice, now slightly more animated, completely oblivious to the fact that I was stranded outside. The conversation had been going on for at least 15 minutes now and showed no signs of ending. What kind of phone call requires locking your husband out of his own home? My neighbor disappeared into her apartment, but she left her door slightly ajar. I could smell the aroma of actual good coffee drifting out, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time my wife had made coffee for me, or, frankly, done anything that felt welcoming or considerate. I knocked on my door again, this time with more authority. "This is getting ridiculous," I called out. "Open the door." "Just 5 more minutes," came her irritated response. "This is important." 5 more minutes. Like I was some kind of inconvenience in my own life. I looked at my neighbor's partially open door, then back at my own closed one. The contrast wasn't lost on me. One door was locked tight, keeping me out. The other was open, inviting me in. That's when I heard my neighbor's voice. Soft, but clear enough for me to hear. "Coffee is ready when you are. And honestly, any man who gets locked out of his own place deserves better treatment than that." My wife's voice suddenly got louder behind the door, as if she sensed something was shifting in the hallway, but it was too late. The seed was planted. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like someone actually valued my presence instead of treating it like an obligation. I realized this wasn't just about being locked out. This was about respect, about boundaries, and about a woman who had apparently forgotten that marriage is supposed to be a partnership, not a dictatorship. My neighbor across the hall had just reminded me what consideration looked like, and the contrast was striking. The question was, how long was I going to stand in this hallway, waiting for permission to enter my own home? 23 minutes. That's how long I stood in that hallway before I heard the chain latch finally slide open. 23 minutes of my life wasted, standing outside my own home like some kind of vagrant. When the door opened, my wife appeared with that casual expression people wear when they've done absolutely nothing wrong. "Sorry about that," she said, not sounding sorry at all. That call ran longer than expected. No explanation, no real apology, just a dismissive shrug as she walked back toward the kitchen, expecting me to follow like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something had fundamentally shifted, and I wasn't about to pretend otherwise. "Who was so important that you had to lock me out of my own home?" I asked, setting my keys down with deliberate force on the counter. She turned around, and I could see that flicker of annoyance cross her face. The same look she gave me whenever I dared to question her decisions or priorities. "It was private," she said, as if that explained everything. "Some conversations require privacy, you know. I can't have you walking around making noise, interrupting my thoughts." "Interrupting your thoughts," I repeated slowly. "In my own home." "Our home," she corrected with that tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, while being completely unreasonable. "And yes, sometimes I need space to think, to have conversations without distractions. I thought you'd understand that." The audacity was breathtaking. She was actually trying to make this sound logical, like locking your husband out was some kind of normal boundary-setting behavior. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning against the counter. "You think it's acceptable to lock me out whenever you decide you need space in our shared living space?" "Don't be dramatic," she replied, waving her hand dismissively. "It was just for a few minutes. 23 minutes. She paused, clearly not expecting me to have been counting. "Well, these things take time. Adult conversations can't be rushed." Adult conversations. As if I was some kind of child who couldn't be trusted around her precious phone calls. I was about to respond when there was a gentle knock at our door. My wife and I both looked toward the sound. Through the peephole, I could see my neighbor from across the hall holding what looked like a small plate. "I'll get it," I said. But my wife was already moving toward the door. "No, I will," she said quickly, something sharp in her voice. But I was closer, and I opened the door first. My neighbor stood there with a warm smile, holding a plate of what looked like homemade cookies. "Hi there," she said, looking directly at me before glancing at my wife. "I made too many chocolate chip cookies and thought I'd share. Seemed like you might need something sweet after your wait outside." The way she said it, with just the right amount of innocent concern mixed with subtle acknowledgement of how ridiculous the situation had been, was perfect. My wife's face immediately tightened. "That's very thoughtful," I said, accepting the plate. "They smell incredible." "I use real butter," my neighbor said with a smile. "Makes all the difference. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting anything important." The word important hung in the air with just enough emphasis to make it clear she'd heard everything that had transpired in the hallway earlier. "No interruption at all," I replied. "We were just discussing household communication protocols." My neighbor's eyes sparkled with amusement at my diplomatic phrasing. "Well, if you ever need to discuss anything else, or if you find yourself locked out again, you know where to find me." My wife stepped forward then, clearly not liking the direction this conversation was heading. "Thank you for the cookies," she said with forced politeness. "That was very neighborly of you." "Of course," my neighbor replied smoothly. "We should all look out for each other, especially when someone's having a rough day." She looked directly at me when she said this. After she left, my wife closed the door with more force than necessary. "What was that about?" she demanded. "What was what about?" "A neighbor being kind. The way she was looking at you. The way you were looking at her." I almost laughed. Here she was worried about looks and glances when she just spent the better part of an hour treating me like an unwelcome intruder in my own home. "Maybe you should be more concerned about how you treat your husband than how the neighbors treat him," I said calmly. "Don't turn this around on me," she snapped. "I needed privacy for an important call. And instead of being understanding, you're out there chatting up the neighbor like some kind of victim. Privacy that required locking me out. Yes, if that's what it takes." There it was. The truth, finally. She genuinely believed she had the right to exclude me from my own home whenever she deemed it necessary. No discussion, no compromise, just her unilateral decision that I could wait outside like a dog. I took a bite of the cookie. It was excellent, warm, and perfectly sweetened. Real butter, like she'd said. "These are really good," I said. My wife stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "That's what you're focusing on right now?" "I'm focusing on the difference between someone who shows consideration and someone who doesn't." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to voice yet. The next few days were tense, with my wife acting like nothing had happened, while simultaneously watching my every move. She'd gotten it into her head that my neighbor was somehow a threat, which was rich considering she was the one who'd created this entire situation by locking me out. Friday evening, she decided to test her boundaries again. I came home to find the chain latch secured once more. This time, I didn't even bother knocking gently. I pounded on the door with enough force to make it rattle in its frame. "Open this door right now," I called out, my voice carrying down the hallway. "I'm on another important call," came her muffled response. "Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes? like she was doing me some kind of favor by reducing the waiting time. I looked at that locked door and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't about phone calls anymore. This was about control, about her testing how much disrespect I'd tolerate. I turned around and walked straight to my neighbor's door. She opened it before I could even knock, like she'd been expecting this. "Locked out again?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Apparently, I need to make an appointment to enter my own home now," I said. She stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "Well, my home doesn't require appointments. Come on in." Her apartment was the mirror image of mine, but it felt completely different. Where my place always seemed cluttered and tense, hers was clean, welcoming with soft lighting and the lingering scent of something that smelled like vanilla and sandalwood. "Coffee or something stronger?" she asked, closing the door behind me. "Something stronger sounds perfect right about now." She poured 2 glasses of what looked like good whiskey, not the cheap stuff my wife bought when she bothered to buy alcohol at all. She said, settling onto the couch beside me, close enough that I caught her perfume. "How long has she been playing these little power games?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. Most people dance around marital issues, but she just cut straight to the heart of it. "Honestly, I'm not sure when it started. It's been gradual, like boiling a frog. Except frogs are smart enough to jump out when the water gets too hot," she said with a smile that was both sympathetic and knowing. From across the hall, I could hear my wife's voice getting louder. Apparently, her important call had taken on a more animated tone. "Sounds like she's really getting into it over there," my neighbor observed. "Yeah, these calls are always mysteriously crucial whenever I come home. Funny how she never seems to have them when I'm already inside." My neighbor leaned back, studying me with those intelligent eyes. "You know what I think? I think she's testing you, seeing how much she can get away with before you finally say enough." "And what makes you such an expert on marital dynamics?" I asked, though not unkindly. "Because I was married to someone who did the exact same thing. Different tactics, same goal, control through manufactured crisis." There was something in her voice that told me she understood this game from personal experience. "What did you do about it?" "I stopped playing," she said simply. "Turns out when you refuse to participate in someone's power games, they either change the rules or find someone else to play with." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our drinks. Through the wall, I could hear my wife's voice rising and falling, still deep in her mysterious conversation. "Can I ask you something?" my neighbor said. "Shoot. When's the last time she made you feel welcome in your own home?" The question hit harder than I expected. I tried to think of a recent example, something that would prove my marriage wasn't as broken as it was starting to seem. I started, then stopped. That's a harder question to answer than it should be. That's not a good sign. No, it's not. She moved slightly closer on the couch, her knee almost touching mine. "You know, when my ex used to pull his control stunts, I used to think it was my fault somehow, like I wasn't being understanding enough or supportive enough." How long did that last? Too long, until I realized that the problem wasn't my reaction to his behavior. The problem was his behavior, period. From across the hall came the sound of a door slamming. My wife had apparently finished her call and discovered I wasn't sitting outside like an obedient pet. "Sounds like she's noticed you're not where she left you," my neighbor said with amusement. Almost immediately, there was aggressive knocking on the neighbor's door. "She's got some nerve," my neighbor muttered, but she was smiling as she said it. The knocking continued, more insistent now. "You know," she said, making no move to get up, "we could just ignore it. See how long she's willing to make a fool of herself in the hallway." I had to admit, there was something appealing about that idea. Let her stand out there knocking, getting increasingly frustrated, while I sat here in a warm, welcoming space with an attractive woman who actually seemed to enjoy my company. "What do you think?" she asked. "Ready to see what happens when you stop playing her game?" The knocking got louder, more desperate. My wife was clearly not used to being ignored. "You know what?" I said, settling back into the couch. "I think I'd like to see exactly that." My neighbor smiled and refilled my glass. "Good choice. The show's just getting started." The knocking eventually stopped, but I could hear my wife pacing in the hallway, her footsteps sharp and agitated against the floor. Every few minutes she'd try again, alternating between aggressive pounding and what sounded like her ear pressed against the door, trying to hear what was happening inside. "She's really committed to this performance," my neighbor observed, glancing toward the door with amusement. "She's not used to not getting her way immediately," I replied. "Well, She's about to get a crash course in patience. We talked for another hour and I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. I was enjoying myself, actually enjoying a conversation with a woman who listened when I spoke, who didn't interrupt every sentence with corrections or criticisms, who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. When my neighbor suggested ordering dinner, I didn't hesitate. "Chinese or Italian?" she asked, already reaching for her phone. "Surprise me," I said. I'm starting to like surprises. She ordered Italian, and when the delivery arrived 30 minutes later, she did something that floored me. She insisted on paying, saying I was her guest. When was the last time my wife had treated me like a guest worth impressing instead of a roommate she barely tolerated? We were just settling down to eat when my wife's voice came through the door, no longer knocking, but actually calling out. "I know you're in there," she said, her voice strained. "This is ridiculous. Come home right now." My neighbor paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Come home like you're a child who missed curfew." That's exactly how she sees it, I realized. And how do you see it? I looked around her apartment at the candles she'd lit, at the actual cloth napkins she'd set out, at the way she'd plated the takeout food like it was a real dinner instead of just fuel to survive another day. "I see a woman who knows how to make someone feel valued," I said. The smile she gave me was warm and genuine. "Good answer." From the hallway came more pacing, then what sounded like my wife's phone ringing. I could hear her answering it, her voice taking on that sweet, reasonable tone she used when talking to other people. "Yes, I'm fine," she was saying. "Just a small disagreement with my husband, nothing serious." My neighbor and I exchanged a look. "Small disagreement," I muttered. "She locks me out of my own home and now it's a small disagreement." "She's managing the narrative," my neighbor said. "Probably calling her sister or her mom, getting them to tell her she's right to be upset." She was absolutely correct. I could hear my wife's voice getting more animated, more self-righteous, as whoever was on the other end apparently validated her position. "You know what the real problem is?" my neighbor said, setting down her wine glass. "She's never had to face real consequences for treating you badly." "What do you mean?" "I mean, what's the worst thing that's happened to her when she disrespects you? You get quiet for a day, you sleep on the couch. You have an argument that ends with you apologizing for something that wasn't your fault." I thought about it, and she was right. My wife's bad behavior never actually cost her anything. I always just absorbed it, worked around it, tried to keep the peace. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time she learned that actions have consequences." From the hallway, I heard my wife ending her phone call, then trying our door again, more frantically this time. "She's getting desperate," my neighbor observed. "Good. You really think this is good?" "I think a woman who locks her husband out of his own home and then throws a tantrum when he finds somewhere else to be has earned a little desperation." She had a point. My wife had created this situation entirely on her own. She'd made the choice to exclude me, and now she was upset that I'd found somewhere else to go. "There's something else," my neighbor said, her voice softer now. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about asking you over for dinner for months. A real dinner, not takeout." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The way the candlelight caught her eyes. The way she'd been nothing but kind and welcoming since the moment we'd met. The contrast with my wife, who treated kindness like a limited resource that had to be carefully rationed, was stark. "Why didn't you?" I asked. "Because you were married, and I respect that. But watching how she treats you..." She shook her head. "Life's too short to watch good people get mistreated." From outside came the sound of my wife's key in her own door, followed by the slam as she went back into our apartment. A few minutes later, my phone started buzzing with texts. "Let me guess," my neighbor said. "She's moved on to digital harassment." I glanced at the messages. They started reasonable and quickly devolved into accusations and demands. "She wants to know where I am and when I'm coming home." "Are you going to tell her?" I looked around her warm, welcoming apartment, then at my phone full of angry messages from the woman who'd locked me out of my own home just hours earlier. "Not yet," I said, turning the phone face down on the table. "I think I'd like to finish this excellent dinner first." My neighbor's smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd say that." By 10 o'clock, my phone had buzzed with 17 texts and 4 missed calls. My wife had progressed from confused to angry to what could only be described as panic. The last message read, "If you don't come home right now, I'm calling the police." "The police?" My neighbor laughed when I showed her. "For what? Having dinner with a neighbor? She's losing control of the situation, and she knows it." We were sitting closer now, The dinner long finished, sharing a bottle of wine she'd opened. The conversation had moved from my marriage troubles to everything else. Her work, my interests, places we'd traveled, books we'd read. It struck me how long it had been since I'd had a real conversation with my wife about anything beyond logistics and complaints. That's when the pounding started again. But this time, it was different, louder, more frantic, accompanied by my wife's voice calling my name through the door. "Open this door right now," she was shouting. "I know you're in there with her." My neighbor sighed. Well, subtle was never going to last forever. The pounding continued, and now I could hear other doors in the hallway opening. Our neighbors were coming out to see what the commotion was about. "Should we?" I asked, gesturing toward the door. "Oh, absolutely. This is about to get interesting." When we opened the door, my wife was standing there in her pajamas and a robe, her hair disheveled, facing a small audience of curious neighbors. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "There you are," she said, pointing at me like I was a criminal. "What do you think you're doing?" "Something you made impossible in our own home," I replied calmly. "That's not the point. You can't just disappear and ignore my calls." "Actually," said Mrs. Chun from down the hall, "he can do whatever he wants." "This is quite a scene you're making, dear." My wife spun around, clearly not expecting commentary from the peanut gallery. "This is between my husband and me." "Then maybe keep it between your husband and you," suggested the college kid from 4 billions. "Some of us have early classes tomorrow." My neighbor stepped forward and I noticed how poised she looked compared to my wife's frantic appearance. "I invited him for dinner," she said simply, "after he was locked out of his own apartment." Again, the emphasis on again wasn't lost on anyone. A few of the neighbors exchanged glances. "You had no right," my wife snapped. "I had every right to invite a neighbor for dinner. Just like you apparently have the right to lock him out whenever you feel like it. That's different. That's private." "Honey," said Mr. Rodriguez from 4A, "nothing's private when you're screaming in the hallway at 10 p.m. My wife looked around at the faces surrounding her, and I could see the moment she realized how this looked. A woman in her pajamas making a scene in the hallway because her husband had dinner with a neighbor after she locked him out of his own home. "This is insane," she said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "What's insane?" I said, my voice carrying clearly down the hall. "Is a wife who thinks she can treat her husband like an unwelcome visitor in his own home and then throw a tantrum when he finds somewhere else to go." I didn't throw a tantrum. The silence that followed was deafening. Even she seemed to realize how that sounded given her current behavior. "Look," said Mrs. Chun kindly, "maybe you two should talk about this privately. But quietly, some of us work early shifts." "There's nothing to talk about," my wife said. But she was looking at me when she said it, and there was something desperate in her eyes now. "He needs to come home now." "Actually," my neighbor said, "he doesn't need to do anything. He's a grown man who can make his own decisions about where he spends his evening." My wife turned to her with real venom now. "Stay out of this. This is my marriage. Then maybe try treating it like one instead of a dictatorship." The college kid actually snickered at that, which made my wife's face turn an even deeper shade of red. "You know what?" I said, looking directly at my wife. "I think I'll finish my evening here. We can talk tomorrow when you've calmed down. Don't you dare walk away from me." But I was already turning back toward my neighbor's door. The other neighbors began dispersing, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating drama. "This isn't over," my wife called after me. I paused and turned back to face her. "You're right, it's not. But it's not going to continue like this either." My neighbor opened her door wider, and I walked through. As she closed it behind us, I could hear my wife still standing in the hallway, but the fight had gone out of her voice. She was talking to herself now, trying to process what had just happened. "Well," my neighbor said, leaning against the closed door, "that was certainly educational. I'm sorry you got dragged into this." "Are you kidding? That was the most entertainment I've had in months," she grinned. "Besides, someone needed to see her behavior for what it really is." From the hallway came the sound of my wife's door slamming shut, followed by blessed silence. "Think she learned anything from that?" I asked. My neighbor poured herself another glass of wine. "Oh, she learned something. Whether she learned the right thing remains to be seen." I woke up on my neighbor's couch the next morning to the smell of real breakfast being cooked. Not microwave frozen waffles or cereal eaten standing over the sink, but actual eggs and bacon sizzling in a pan. When was the last time I'd woken up to that sound? "Good morning," she said when I appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I hope you like your eggs over easy." I like them however someone else cooks them, I said, and she laughed. Low standards. I can work with that. As we ate breakfast together, my phone buzzed with a text from my wife. We need to talk. I'm sorry about last night. Let me guess, my neighbor said, noticing my expression. Apology text. How did you know? Because she spent all night realizing how badly she embarrassed herself in front of the neighbors. Now she's in damage control mode. She was right. Of course, my wife's apologies always came after she'd pushed things too far and needed to reset the dynamic before facing real consequences. Are you going to talk to her? Eventually, but not on her timeline. My neighbor smiled approvingly. Good. Let her sit with the uncertainty for a while. I spent the morning at my neighbor's place and it was remarkable how normal it felt. She worked from home as a graphic designer, so she set up her laptop at the kitchen table while I read a book from her impressive library. No drama, no tension, just two adults sharing space comfortably. Around noon, there was a soft knock at the door. My wife's voice came through, much quieter than the night before. I know you're in there. Please, can we just talk? My neighbor looked at me questioningly. I nodded and went to open the door. My wife stood there looking genuinely contrite, her hair properly done, wearing one of her nicer outfits. She'd clearly put effort into her appearance. Can we talk privately? She asked, glancing nervously at my neighbor. We can talk, I said. Here, in front of her. She's the one who's been treating me with respect lately. I think she's earned the right to hear how this plays out. My wife's face tightened, but she stepped inside when I gestured. I'm sorry about last night, she began. I was upset and I overreacted. Which part are you sorry about? Locking me out, ignoring me for hours, or making a scene in the hallway? All of it, she said quickly. I realize I've been unreasonable lately. Lately? She paused, clearly not expecting me to push back on her timeline. Okay, for a while now. I know I haven't been the best wife. My neighbor was listening quietly from the kitchen, not intruding, but not pretending she couldn't hear either. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. I want you to come home. We can work this out. I'll be more considerate about my phone calls, and we can set up some kind of system. A system? I repeated flatly. Yes. So we both know when I need privacy and you won't feel locked out. There it was. Even in her apology, she was still defending her right to exclude me from my own home. She was just offering to give me advance notice. Let me ask you something, I said. When you lock me out for your private calls, who exactly are you talking to? She hesitated just a fraction too long. Just friends. My sister sometimes. It's not important who, but that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. My neighbor caught it too. I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm but firm. I'm not coming home today. Maybe not tomorrow either. I need time to think about whether this marriage is worth saving. What do you mean? Panic crept into her voice. Of course it's worth saving. Is it? Because, from where I'm standing, it looks like you want a roommate who pays half the bills and stays out of your way when convenient. That's not a marriage. That's not fair. What's not fair is being treated like an inconvenience in my own life. My neighbor spoke up then, her voice gentle but clear. Maybe this is something you two should discuss when you've both had more time to think. My wife turned to her with real hostility. This is your fault. He was never like this before you started filling his head with ideas. I didn't fill his head with anything, my neighbor replied calmly. I just showed him what it feels like to be treated with basic courtesy. The truth of that statement hung in the air like a challenge. Choose, my wife said suddenly, turning back to me. Her or me, right now. The ultimatum was so perfectly typical of her approach to problems. Create a crisis. Force an immediate decision. Avoid any actual examination of the underlying issues. You know what, I said. I choose respect. I choose being valued. I choose being with someone who sees my presence as a gift, not an obligation. So, you're choosing her? I'm choosing myself. For the first time in years, I'm choosing what I deserve. My wife stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing the fact that her usual tactics weren't working. Fine, she said finally. But don't come crawling back when you realize what a mistake you're making. I won't, I said simply. After she left, my neighbor came over and sat beside me on the couch. You okay? She asked. Better than I've been in years, actually. Good, because I meant what I said yesterday about that dinner invitation, a real one this time. I looked at her. This woman who'd shown me more consideration in 2 days than my wife had in 2 years. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that very much. Later that evening, as we planned that dinner, I realized something important. I hadn't just ended my marriage. I'd started my life over. And for the first time in years, I was genuinely excited about what came next.